Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a fascinating piece of history, the evolution of a major religious and cultural movement that literally reshaped the landscape of 20th century Christianity. We're talking about the origins of neo-evangelism. It's this wild story full of theological battles, cultural retreats, and a pretty dramatic internal uprising. Okay, let's dive into this. The big question we're tackling today is, what exactly is a neo-evangelical? Now, I know it sounds like this highly technical, maybe kind of obscure academic term, right? But uncovering the history behind this one single phrase reveals a massive historical mystery. It tells us exactly how modern Christian culture fractured, divided, and then ultimately rebuilt itself. So, here's our roadmap for how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the Great Theological Rift. Second, the fortress mindset. Third, the neo-evangelical uprising. And finally, we'll wrap up with the modern evangelical legacy. All right, starting with part one, the Great Theological Rift. Let's set the stage in the early 20th century. Back then, a massive, truly seismic split happened within Christendom. The battle lines were drawn clearly between two totally distinct camps. On one side, we have the fundamentalists. They held strictly to the historical fundamentals of the faith, things like the divine inspiration of Scripture and the deity of Christ. And on the other side, the modernists, or liberals. They were ready to jettison those strict doctrinal positions, choosing instead to focus heavily on ethics and personal religious feelings. Let's look a little closer at that modernist perspective. Their whole worldview was heavily shaped by modern skeptical scholarship. And because of that lens, they viewed the Bible primarily as a human book. To them, Jesus was mainly a great moral teacher, and their overarching focus shifted away from strict dogma and toward ethics, specifically the idea of loving your neighbor. They were also super accepting of modern evolutionary theories and were open to the idea that non-Christians could absolutely have a relationship with God. Armed with this progressive scholarship, modernists gradually gained a ton of power and influence in various seminaries and church denominations. But in stark contrast, you've got the fundamentalist beliefs. They held fiercely to the absolute inspiration of Scripture, the virgin birth of Christ, his actual deity, his substitutionary death, and the literal second coming of Christ. For them, these weren't just nice theological suggestions, they were absolute non-negotiables. So as the modernists started taking institutional power, the fundamentalists faced a really tough choice. They either left these institutions voluntarily so they could form their own separate denominations and seminaries, or they were forced out entirely. Let's move to part two and see how this builds the fortress mindset. So once the fundamentalists were culturally and institutionally sidelined, how exactly did they react? Well, they developed what we call the fortress mindset. This was an intentional, deliberate approach of separating themselves completely from the secular world. See, in their eyes, modern scholarship had led the liberal modernists completely astray, so the fundamentalists decided to just broadly reject modern scholarship altogether. Instead, they sought to basically occupy till he comes. They withdrew from the broader culture, all while still remaining fervently dedicated to evangelism, just from safely within their walls. To put that into perspective and really understand what this looked like day to day, the fortress mindset wasn't just abstract theology. It meant strict opposition to everyday cultural activities. We're talking about boycotting modern music, dancing, drinking, and even going to the movies. The fortress was built with very tangible, daily behavioral boundaries. The whole goal was to keep the secular world out and maintain strict moral purity. Which brings us to part three, the neo-evangelical uprising. Now, as you probably know, walls rarely hold forever without some internal pressure. As time went on, a growing discontent began to simmer. Critics starting popping up from within the fundamentalist ranks, feeling like their predecessors had isolated themselves entirely too much. They looked around and realized, hey, by walling ourselves off in this fortress, we've completely abandoned rigorous evangelical scholarship. These internal critics didn't want to hide anymore. They wanted direct, actual cultural engagement and a return to serious academic thought. Now, what's really fascinating here is how rapidly this internal pushback exploded into a fully recognized movement. Both of the pivotal events driving this happened in a single year, 1947. First, a theologian named Carl Henry publishes a groundbreaking book called The Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism. It functioned as a massive wake-up call. And then in that exact same year, Harold J. Okenga officially coins the brand new term neo-evangelical. Boom. In just 1 year, they had a manifesto and a brand new identity. Their exact goal was a deliberate call to, quote, distinguish themselves from the more strident and separatist forms of fundamentalism. They were drawing a very clear line in the sand. They definitely weren't abandoning their core historical theology, but they were absolutely rejecting the isolationist, combative methods of that fortress mindset. So, who were the leaders actually pushing this forward? Well, here's our primary cast of characters. You have Carl Henry, the prominent theologian, who provided the intellectual framework. Then there's Billy Graham, a name you undoubtedly recognize, who became the most public, visible face of this entire new approach. And the magazine Christianity Today was literally founded to be the voice and the publishing arm for the movement. Together, they championed this whole new era of cooperating with broader Christian groups and actively engaging with society. But naturally, every action has a reaction. Let's look at the tension this caused. The neo-evangelicals were seeking cultural engagement and a return to modern scholarship. But the fundamentalist reaction? It was severe. The old guard felt this new group was entirely too accommodating to the world. To the strict fundamentalists, engaging the culture meant compromising. They felt the neo-evangelicals were abandoning moral standards and playing nice with the exact worldly forces they had built their fortress to keep out.
And that brings us to our final chapter, the modern evangelical legacy. Why does all this history actually matter right now?
Well, bringing this narrative into the present day, we uncover a pretty crucial point. The specific term neo-evangelical actually has very little currency today. It has almost entirely vanished from common use. Despite all those manifestos, the new magazines, and the massive theological battles of the 1940s, the specific label they fought so hard to establish, it just didn't stick around in our modern vocabulary. Instead, we use this label, evangelical. Today, this massive demographic identifier is used by the exact people who hold the historical positions of mid-20th century neo-evangelicalism. Today's evangelicals are the direct descendants of that 1947 uprising. They just dropped the neo over time. Though, and this is a pretty fascinating historical footnote, there are still self-described fundamentalists today who will use the term neo-evangelical as a slight, basically as a way to point out someone they view as less than truly faithful. So that brings us to a final provocative thought. We've watched how a group built a massive fortress to protect itself, only to end up sparking an uprising from its own internal ranks. As today's modern cultural and religious movements build their own fortresses and draw new lines of strict separation, who will spark the next internal uprising? History is cyclical, and understanding our past is absolutely the best way to see the future. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep engaging with the facts, and I'll see you next time.